December 4th, 2000.
Today was not a good day in the ring for Al Gore.
I do believe I have won this election.
It began with a body blow from the United States Supreme Court.
We are very gratified by the United States Supreme Court's decision today,
which was followed by a potential knockout punch by a Florida Circuit Court.
A reasonable probability that the results of the election would have been changed must be shown.
But the Vice President still has not thrown in the towel.
We have filed this afternoon an appeal to the District Court of Appeals with a request that it be certified as a matter of great public importance and urgency to the Florida Supreme Court.
Tonight is the Gore campaign down for the count. The nation waits.
From ABC News, this is Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Chris Bury.
Choose your cliche. Back against the wall, on the edge, behind in the bottom of the 10th. Or imagine for a moment the plight of a juggler, a fairly accomplished one, who is spinning a number of plates. You've seen those performers who can twirl them on their hands, heads, and even on sticks in their teeth. Time is their enemy. If one plate loses its momentum and drops, the juggler can keep going. The more plates that fall, the harder it is to maintain balance. That's the predicament Vice President Gore is in right now. Today, one of his plates came crashing down. Another slipped, at least temporarily, out of his grip. He's still juggling, but time is running out because of two big court decisions. Florida Judge N. Sanders Sauls rejected Al Gore's request for partial recounts in 3 Florida counties. The Vice President's lawyers have already filed an appeal. But their hurdle is high. Judge Sauls found no basis for recounts, either in law or fact. Earlier today, the U.S. Supreme Court, on a unanimous vote, sent the case debated so eloquently in oral arguments on Friday back to the Florida Supreme Court for clarification. That case, remember, concerns the Florida High Court ruling extending the state's deadline for certifying votes. Tonight, a senior aide to the Vice President insisted Gore would not consider conceding the election until after the Florida Supreme Court hears the appeal of Judge Sauls' ruling today. But it's clear the Vice President's balancing act is getting more precarious by the moment, as we hear from Nightline correspondent John Donvan.
Please be seated.
Late this afternoon, one judge in Florida spoke for 16 minutes.
The court finds that the plaintiffs have failed to carry the requisite burden of proof. The evidence does not establish any illegality. The Dade Board of Canvassing Board did not abuse its discretion.
The upshot, the recounts the Gore campaign so badly needed, denied.
This is
And in an instant, the handwriting appeared on the walls.
And lawyers for Al Gore came to court today in need of a win in the worst way. But they lost, and they lost big.
Make no mistake, the Vice President's prospects of ascending to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
Judge Sanders Sauls' ruling comes down to one simple sentence. On election night, George W. Bush won the state of Florida. That's the evidence. Al Gore did not.
All right, that'll conclude. The court will stand in recess.
There are so many forces arrayed against Gore now, not just in the contest, but in the Supreme Court case earlier in the day, in the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals case, which is still outstanding, in the Florida legislature. There comes a point when you recognize that you just can't win, and Al Gore might be at that point right now.
It is this sort of talk that infuriates the Gore campaign and discourages his supporters. First, they argue it ain't over till it's over, and the Gore campaign is appealing today's decision. Second, they remain convinced, and this is an article of faith, that if you could just count those ballots now, the Vice President would win this thing. But faith was not enough for a judge in Tallahassee named N. Sanders Sauls.
Can we make sure that they don't squeeze the cards?
Florida law requires a losing candidate not just to prove the votes were miscounted, but also that there were enough of them to show the election may have gone to the wrong candidate. Gore's lawyers argued there are some 14,000 ballots in dispute, but Judge Sauls ruled
There is no credible statistical evidence and no other competent substantial evidence to establish by a preponderance a reasonable probability that the results of the statewide election in the state of Florida would be different from the result which has been certified.
That statement by Sauls amounts to what in legal terms is called a finding of fact. And that means even more trouble for the Gore team.
Finding of fact is significant because in Florida courts, findings of fact by trial courts are given presumptions of correctness, which means that the Gore forces will have to prove some flaw in the judge's reasoning that goes beyond simply that the judge got it wrong.
Which is exactly what Gore's lawyers now plan to do. Tonight they sent in the paperwork to launch an appeal. Where are they going with this? Well, if you saw the live truck shots on TV last week, the trucks carrying ballots from Palm Beach and Miami-Dade counties for safekeeping in Judge Saul's courthouse, that's where they're going with this. The ballots in those trucks.
The ballots were the best evidence. And unfortunately, this ruling comes without the judge having looked at a single ballot. Even though those ballots were admitted into evidence, none of those ballots have been reviewed.
In other words, they're going to argue that Judge Sauls didn't do his job right. Maybe, but maybe Gore's lawyers simply didn't make their case very well. Conceivably, they could have presented evidence that Democratic votes were unfairly undercounted, and they didn't necessarily need a ballot count to do that.
Frankly, if he had another statistician that could have simply said, I looked at the precincts, here are the voting patterns in the precincts, many of those votes are Democratic votes. That would have probably been sufficient.
Recess.
Judge Saul's decision stole a lot of thunder from another ruling today, this one from the U.S. Supreme Court here in Washington, also a setback for Al Gore. Remember, only 3 days ago, there were crowds on the steps and oral arguments inside the Bush campaign trying to reverse a Florida Supreme Court decision that had changed the ballot counting deadline in the vice president's favor.
Today, the justices ruled unanimously, and they did not reverse, but they did the next best thing from the point of view of the Bush campaign. They vacated the Florida court's ruling, which means that the ruling has no legal standing, at least until the Florida justices clarify their reasoning. One theory holds that the court did this, focused on this narrow issue, because it was split on the bigger issues.
I think the last thing that the justices want, just as a matter of the institutional interest of the Supreme Court, the last thing they want is a narrow split, especially if it's going to be a split along ideological lines. Then the Supreme Court just looks as divided as the rest of us.
We saw both candidates today. Governor Bush spoke with reporters in Texas, saying that he would not be publicly asking Al Gore to concede.
That's a very difficult decision for anybody to make, and I understand that.
We also saw Al Gore, but he did not talk with reporters. Speaking of divided, this was once again tonight the sidewalk outside Gore's residence. Call them diehards, those who like Gore and those who don't.
Get out of Cheney's house!
One way to spend a Monday night. I'm John Donvan for Nightline in Washington.
Just how bad a day was it for Al Gore? The legal and political views when we come back.
This is ABC News Nightline.